Hello, and welcome to week 8 of the Troy Literature course, Literature After 1860. Just to let you know, you have all taken the midterm. I've also submitted all the grades, so you should be able to access all the feedback and everything else that goes along with the midterm. I am also scheduling phone conversations with a lot of you this week. I've already spoken to a number of you over the weekend and, of course, at the end of last week. I look forward to talking with all of you. These are short 10-minute calls just to give you a chance to make sure that you're comfortable with the format and that you know where we're going for the future. Week 8 is really a focus on literature of the 1950s. This allows us the opportunity to really think about the gap between modernism, which pretty much ended after World War II, and postmodernism, which is what the 1950s literature is building as a foundation of. The last week's postings, week 7, dealt with the Harlem Renaissance and some confessional poetry. There were also, of course, Dos Passos was in there, who is one of our the modernist canon writers. Most of you did remark on the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance actually received the most feedback. Althea mentioned that the Harlem Renaissance, that the values were central to the field. We also had, let's see, Carmen mentioned specifically in relation to Langston Hughes, the Weary Blues, that the Harlem Renaissance represented a rebirth of black culture, starting, of course, in the 1920s. We also had Gwendolyn, who mentioned that the Harlem Renaissance captured a time of struggle and expression. We had we had the popularity. Justin mentioned that the Harlem Renaissance in literature really proposed this popularity of the blues culture. We also had Michelle Johnson, who mentioned that the Harlem Renaissance really focused on a good reading of the African American culture in relation to what was going on at the time. And then, of course, we did have a couple other observations in relation to the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance is, as some of you have mentioned, one of the first major self-conscious literary movements in African American writing. Although there's been much more that has come past it, this was kind of our first focus for the African American writer. It began immediately following the First World War, and it kind of connected to the massive migration of the Southern black population to the northern cities. There was also a large group, a number of talented writers who congregated in Harlem, and this was kind of their cultural and intellectual capital. You had a number of writers, musicians, etc. It was very intellectual, and it was also kind of a sense of the intellectual and artistic movement that mirrored what was going on. Now, many of you referenced in relation to the Harlem Renaissance, Claude McKay. We had Angela, who mentioned that she really did have, felt an expression and admiration of not just the poetry, but an admiration for the art form of dance in his poetry. We also have under, let's see, Betty mentioned that it captured the lower class life well. We had also that Charles mentioned that this work, along with the others, expresses issues of gender and class, which are central to the Harlem Renaissance. Corwin mentioned that the poetry in this work and in this reading was often sad or disjointed. Deborah S. really proposed that Claude McKay, the imagery brings to light the degradation of the humanity. And McKay is really a complex relationship between form and content in the verse. They're not free verse. They're kind of unrhymed. They're honest, spontaneous, and emotional intensity. They all kind of reference attention to social practice, conventional belief, and ordinary value. We also had a hint, Justin mentioned, a hint of survival as a theme in Claude's work. And then, of course, Lacey mentioned as an indicative of all of Harlem Renaissance, not just Claude McKay's work, that one should not judge a book by its cover. We had, in addition, we had one other, the idea that there's a pain in it and a similarity of struggles, as Ponzetia pointed out. The similarity of struggles in all of these works, but also, of course, appearing in Mackay. We did also have, in the Harlem Renaissance, some individuals who really did focus on Zora Neale Hurston. Hurston is an interesting figure, as she did work as an anthropologist. Her biography is quite fascinating. There's a little bit of intrigue in that she did lie about her age. And she also attended graduate school for anthropology. She is from Florida and Eatonville. She wrote a number of texts. Mules and Men are one of them, and of course she covered Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is one of her more popular pieces of long fiction. But she wrote a number of short stories too, and you read The Gilded Six Bits. Many of you reference that that in The Gilded Six Bits, as I mentioned, Betty mentioned that capturing of lower class life. Brandy mentioned the playfulness of the text and the subject matter itself. We also had, in relation to the whole work, this theme of alienation, marginality, and two-ness, this doubling that you see not only in Hurston works, but throughout all of the readings. Alienation also appears in Hurston, not as much as it does in the others, but Joe L. really did mention that there's more to life than just the money that one gets. There's also the sense of community. And then, of course, we had, in relation to Hurston, the sense of the pain felt after slavery. And this Raymond Young mentioned in relation to both Hurston and Toomer. Now, Toomer, the work Cain, is actually quite an interesting book in that it's not just one text. It's very much like Dos Passos, USA. It's very much an interweaving of short fiction, snippets of real life, poetry, song, etc. It is really a kind of a balancing and mixing of folk tale and folk story. A combination of fiction and nonfiction, as Adrian mentioned, which also compares well to Dos Passos. So we could think of Toomer and Dos Passos as kind of being two different sides of a coin during this period. We have, in the sense, in relation to Toomer, the plots fleeing Laird. Jeffrey S. mentioned this. We also have the sense of the kind of balancing and manipulation of it all, the raw and tenderness, and of course the all-encompassing portrait that both Dos Passos and Toomer tried to capture of their experience. Ronaldo really focused on that in Dos Passos. Now, Dos Passos is kind of a, while we compare it with Toomer, we can also look at it as kind of a further explosion of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. You know, thinking of these as fragments of cultural debris that are kind of amassed in the sense of an attempt to make sense of this rapidly changing world and fragmented world. It is very different politically, of course, Toomer and Dos Passos than Eliot. You know, Eliot really does seek to find a refuge in the past and in myth and ancient culture and religion. Dos Passos and Toomer both believe in a sense of reformation and that the power of literature could call attention to and reform these social ills, which you don't really see that happening in, of course, Eliot. He is much more of the past. Now, we did shift in here, and we were moving from this Harlem Renaissance as a bridge between the modern and the postmodern, or contemporary, and we did read a fair bit on the poets of this period. Most of these poets following World War II and from the late 40s and through the 50s are what we would deem as confessional poets. It's a term applied to a group of poets that focus specifically on a public and sometimes painful display of private personal matters. In confessional poetry, the poet often seems to address the audience directly without the invention of a persona. Now, you can see that the Harlem Renaissance poets that we read, mostly Langston Hughes, and then following up with Sylvia Plath and Bishop and the purely confessional poets, are very different from some of the other poets we read earlier. Hughes really is very much tied to the Harlem Renaissance, but he's still kind of confessing this private pain publicly. Many of you mention Hughes in relation to the realism and the capturing of a tempo, and that comes from Deborah W. We also had the sense of the Negro speaks of rivers as being beautiful and very deep, and this is from Joe Pellegrino. We also have, from Michael, the notion from the Negro speaks of rivers from Hughes that poetry expresses the self, and there's that public performance of a private pain or a private feeling that really we see come to fruition in confessional poetry. We also had, the sense of the raw and the tender, and the sense of a kind of pain felt, personal pain felt publicly. Plath, many of you did mention in relation to Plath a sense of her rawness and her pain. Plath is often read as a martyr. She is often read as someone that sacrificed herself at the altar of art. She does exist on the margin of society from the feminist perspective, but she was, of course, a poet that was in a relationship with another poet, an author, Ted Hughes. She lived abroad. She did have a sense of privilege, but she was, of course, finding her voice. April mentioned that in reading her work that she could feel her pain and her marginality in relation to society. Hattie mentioned the focus on Lady Lazarus and being this kind of symbol, the imagery which brings to life the degradation that Plath felt. And then, of course, Jerry mentioned that this fragmentation and this paradox that we will continue to see as we move into and through modernism into postmodernism. We also had, in relation to Plath, Michelle S. mentioned that the poem itself captures a very tragic and bizarre and awe-inspiring experience, and that Naya presents a fairly comprehensive overview of postmodernism and modernism in her introduction that kind of prefaces some of these public-to-private tensions. Rachel B. really focused on the rawness and the pain and the emotion of Plath, and this kind of course, also feeds into Elizabeth Bishop, who is another poet we read, also a confessional poet. She writes, still a public and a private bind, but she really does is reserved, very understated, and she has a sense of self-concealment, almost as if she's trying not to be confessional, even when she is confessional. Lauren mentioned that The Fish, the poem that you read, is very complex in both movement and in verse. And then we also had, in relation to Monica's reading, that there's a tension in letting something go in the release in Bishop's The Fish. We also had Vera, who mentioned the Skunk Hour, which was a poem by Robert Lowell, and Robert Lowell is very much a central figure to the confessional poets. He favored dramatic shifts in voice and form, and he really did like to play with things. He was very much related to Bishop in the sense that it was not as confessional and raw as Plath. And Vera did mention the cuteness of Skunk Hour. This notion of this smallness of the animal. And we did have like I mentioned, we've read Dos Passos. We've done a number of readings for this week. So as you take away from these concepts, I want you to continue to think about what makes these works, just like the works of Ambrose Bierce in Chickamauga, or in Henry James, or Mark Twain, or of course any of the other works that we've read, what makes these either better or worse, or indicate a growth in American literature. Of course, do the readings for this week in relation to 1950s, and do the postings and the response. I look forward to speaking with you all at some point during this week, and I hope that you all have a great day. Thank you so much.